Yeah, I thought people did a really good job with this question, making a comparison between maybe the strategic elements that went into Cyrus's decision to be a relatively benevolent ruler, as opposed to maybe just like the personal or moral reasons behind it. And I don't think it has to be one or the other. I think it's probably a combination of both. I mean, certainly Cyrus saw that you can, in a lot of cases, get further of a carrot than you can a stick, that if you do a lot of work as far as honoring the specific gods and religion of a location, as long as you keep most of the people and the social structure intact, you can ally yourself with the aristocracy or the religious rulers or other people within these various civilizations that he is conquering while still maintaining a spot at the top for himself and the broader Persian Empire, while still being respectful to the people that you are now sort of setting yourself up within the increasing size of his empire. Also, the degree in which he tries to address kind of previous wrongs that had been done, sending people who had been displaced by the Babylonians or the Assyrians back to their homelands, the Jewish population, for example. It's sort of a way of him sort of looking and saying, well, I don't really care where you are, go back to where you think you belong, and trying to sort of redo some of those ruling tactics that had been relatively unpopular by the peoples and the kings and the kingdoms he was conquering and taking them over. Also, the fact that if you leave sort of a ruling class in place, you don't change a whole lot. It also leads to a lot more stability a lot of times within these kingdoms and within these civilizations. And I think even in modern times, if you look at the ideas of reconstructing and state building that have been successful, a lot of times they leave elements of order and stability in place while still kind of changing around the ruling structure. If you want to even think to like Japan after the Second World War, for example, or Germany after the Second World War. And we could see also relatively recently with, for example, the occupation of Iraq following the Second Iraq War, that if you do not include that, it can lead to a lot of conflict and violence and make it a much more difficult job to try to do quote-unquote nation building if there's sort of you remove that level of stability that had been there before and try to start from scratch. So even this far back, Cyrus seems like had some pretty good ideas on how to maintain order and stability and start to construct a sort of joint multicultural ideology and kingdom, because, for example, the construction of his palace wasn't just taking just Persian elements. It was taking elements from all different cultures of his empire and combining them together. And it seems like that's sort of what he wanted to do with his empire as a whole. And future Persian empires are actually going to really be good at replicating that. They're going to be very good at taking a large group of different peoples and religions and ethnic groups and kind of respecting them all to a large degree, and trying to make them all work within this larger political hierarchy which is being established. At the same point in time, it seems like Cyrus the Great just viewed people as people and not objects, and wasn't willing to use violence unless it absolutely was called for, and that, like I said, certainly felt like he could get a lot more with respecting people than he could with, trying to take, for example, the Assyrian method of just instilling fear within the people that they took over or they conquered. So that's one of the reasons why I was comfortable naming my little guy after him, because he's one of the historical figures that I like to look at, that even though you can be a strong and powerful ruler, you don't necessarily have to be a cruel and bloodthirsty ruler at the same point in time.
What were the most important elements enabling the Achaemenids to hold their empire together? What were those particular innovations of Achaemenid government that established administrative traditions that went on to influence the region for centuries to come? I think you really have to start sort of going off of our discussion on Cyrus the Great to talk about that sort of tolerance of diversity. We're not just talking about tolerance of diverse people or religions, but sort of diversity of letting locations sort of do their own thing. If you want to think about it, it's that sort of decentralized ruling system that the Chinese ultimately adapt very well. Um, but the Persians really got it down so that, the main goal wasn't to make everyone Persian. They just wanted to make sure that even though the Persians were sort of controlling the area, that people would have enough autonomy to feel like they did not have a need or a reason to rise up or rebel against the Persian Empire. Now that can work good in some locations and some time periods, not so good in others. For example, because there's um, a lot of leeway given to sort of the governors of the provinces and so forth. If there's a bad governor who's causing problems, that can come back to sort of harm the empire as a whole, which ultimately ends up being the case in their conflict with the Greeks. But in general, it ultimately led to a lot of stability among the empire for a long period of time, because a lot of people and most people in the empire sort of felt like their basic needs were being met with the sort of established power structure. Of course, the dividing the empire up into those various satrapies, or was what they were called. Sort of, you might think of them kind of like states or provinces. Dividing them up into those and trying to sort of regulate those, appointing people into positions of power that already had experience with government, so they weren't just giving them to relatives of the king, but they were trying to pick local people who knew the region, who knew the area, and who had experience sort of governing in those regions. And also, trying to make sure once again that they had enough sort of authority and power to sort of regulate things on the local level. But at the same point in time, trying to keep them in check through a number of different measures. For example, having sort of an independent military garrison that was directly sort of responsible and loyal to the empire, not the governor themselves, not having sort of like regional militaries, having sort of one centralized military was a good way to make sure that if a governor did want to start causing problems, he wasn't going to have a sort of his own private army to do so. Eventually, that's another thing that's going to get the Romans in trouble, for example, and they start sort of appointing politicians their own private armies. That's when you start seeing things sort of snowballing and getting out of hand for the state in general. The Persians are going to try to prevent that from happening. Also, sort of that idea of the eyes and ears of the king, right? These spies that were sent out to sort of monitor the governors of the satrapies and to sort of make sure that everything was on the up and up. They could stop in, they could be like accountant spies, almost like pop up and do an audit to see if make sure the governors weren't holding taxation back or money back. They weren't skimming off the top from the empire, or to make sure that there was no nefarious plots or planning going on and so forth. So trying to keep a close eye on the governors. So appointing governors who were sort of capable in their own right, but making sure that they weren't so capable that they were going to be sort of causing trouble to the empire as a whole. Along with that, you just have sort of a general standardization, particularly of the economy and the legal functions of the empire. So, for example, the standardization of currency helps exchange throughout the empire, helps trade with the empire and outside peoples, and really sort of makes the economy much stronger. This also sort of standardizing tax levies becomes very important, making sure that each sort of province is only paying what they can afford, that they're not sort of just saying everyone needs to pay the same amount, but if one location is very, very wealthy and another location is just sort of barely scraping by, sort of accounting for that in the amount of taxation that they're going to be requiring from each location. And the standardization of laws as well, to try to sort of make things flow smoothly across the empire. And while there was still sort of a lot of leeway as far as letting local jurisdictions have their own authority, they did try to go in and bring some change some laws or alter some laws so that they're sort of more in line with the empire as a whole, as long as it wasn't going to be causing too many problems on that local level and disrupting too many of their traditions and so forth. So trying to make sure that there's a more standardized legal system across the empire as well. Also, just sort of the taking advantage and sort of the emphasis that they placed on communication was very important when you're talking about such a large empire as the Persian Empire. So the construction of the Royal Road and other roads across the empire, of course, that's another element that the Romans are going to be emulating in the future here, as well as other empires throughout throughout history. And sort of the postal service that goes along with it that they developed, sort of that Pony Express style system where they can get messages relayed from one side of the empire to another side very, very quickly. When you're talking about an empire at this size and this early in history, that's a very big advantage for the Persian Empire, because sort of the biggest struggle of these large empires oftentimes is that sort of lack of cohesion and communication. And if there's trouble in one area of the empire, if it's going to take multiple weeks for that news to reach the emperor or the government or the capital, it's going to be much more difficult to sort of respond in time. Whereas if you can get a message there in a matter of a few days, the turnaround and the ability to sort of problem solve is going to be much, much greater. So these are all of the sort of governing systems that the Persians put into place, which were very successful for them and are going to be emulated by future peoples in the region and area as well. Describe the religion of Zoroastrianism. What were its most important beliefs and principles? In what ways was this religion unique from other religious ideas we have learned about so far this semester? Can you identify any ideas present in Zoroastrianism that may have influenced the development of later religions in the region, such as Judaism, Christianity, or Islam? And this is really sort of our first introduction to what we're going to be referring to as Axial Age religions. And we'll be talking much more about the Axial Age next week. But really, it's a time period when the ideas around the world regarding religion begin to change. And Zoroastrianism becomes a very good sort of example of this. Sort of the traditions that we've been talking about thus far resounding religion were sort of very early on this sort of adherence to ancestor worship that evolves eventually into sort of worshipping these anthropomorphic nature gods that usually are very sort of tied in towards agriculture, natural disasters, the sort of concepts that early agriculturalists are concerned about. As time goes on, however, quite often the religious thinking starts to become more concerned with humans living in large groups. So things like regulating human behavior, setting examples for the way people are supposed to be interacting becomes a large part of the Axial Age. Trying to think of what happens after people die. This idea of or concept of an afterlife becomes much more pronounced and important in these Axial Age religions. Just sort of the very way that you sort of philosophize and think about religion, it definitely changes during this time period. And like I said, we'll get into more of the details about the Axial Age next year or next week. But it's important to note that Zoroastrianism is sort of one of the very earliest examples of this, and it's going to be very influential on other religions that are going to be developing in the region as well. So Zoroastrianism, as a lot of people pointed out, was sort of created by a prophet, Zarathustra, who lived around 1000 BCE or so. Some people put that date earlier, some people put it a little bit later. It's hard to tell exactly because, like a lot of the prophets that we're going to be talking about, their exact sort of life or death are going to be unknown. Certainly, some of them we know very clearly, but some are still, a little bit hazy exactly when the individuals might have been living. And like a lot of the prophets that we're going to talk about, there's a period where they left home for a period of time, sort of wandered the land, and sort of had visions. And through these visions, the religion that they came to found were sort of revealed to them. And this religion that Zarathustra is going to be creating is really based around sort of a divine conflict between sort of a benevolent, good god, Ahura Mazda, which sort of translates as wise lord. This, in their belief, was the creator of the world and of all good things. But this sort of good god is always in competition with an evil god, Angarminu, or the evil spirit. And that sort of all of life is a conflict between good and evil, between lightness and darkness. And you're very much going to see this reflected in later theologies. Christianity, for example, is going to have a very strong element of this present in it. Judaism, to a certain degree as well. And while this isn't necessarily strictly monotheism, certainly in the same sense that, let's say, Islam is going to be, which is sort of the most monotheistic religion that we're going to be talking about, it is this idea of sort of having sort of one clear cut deity at the top of sort of all the other gods and spirits in the world, is certainly much different than the sort of broad pantheon of gods that sort of mimicked human behavior that we were learning about the last few weeks. And that's another kind of key element of the Axial Age. The deities in Axial Age religions are much more removed from people. They don't act like people. A lot of times, they're evil sort of far better and more benevolent than people are, or they're much worse and much more evil than people are. Um, and this is very much sort of evidence towards that. You don't see these gods sort of getting drunk and doing misdeeds like the Greek gods or the Mesopotamian gods, and so forth. But a part of this divine conflict, and this is another element that makes it an Axial Age religion, is that the battle that is being played out between good and evil comes down to human beings. That human beings play a very central and important role within this cosmology, and the choices specifically that people make are going to be very, very important. And that's what's going to sort of tip the balance of power towards good or towards evil. And a lot of the future religions are going to sort of have that same idea, right? That the sort of individual morality of people is going to be very, very important in Judaism, Christianity, in Islam, in Buddhism, Hinduism. These are all going to be religions where people play a very central and important role, as opposed to, once more, if you think about the Mesopotamian religions, people were just sort of there. And then the gods just sort of trampled on them if they wanted to, didn't pay a great deal of attention to them. Even in the Egyptian religion, the humans were only sort of important as far as they were sort of filling those roles of the gods. And sort of the basic everyday behavior, while it was important in things like Ma'at, wasn't sort of the central element to the religion. With Zoroastrianism, human choices is everything. And the promotion of really sort of those good thoughts, good words, good deeds is very much central to what people need to be doing in order to sort of help Ahura Mazda be victorious. Now, this doesn't mean cutting out all worldly pleasures, not eating good food, or trying to enjoy life. It doesn't mean being, complete ascetic. Essentially, it says, these sort of pleasures are good and okay, but you need to be doing them in moderation, and you still need to be basing everything on honesty. And that's sort of the key. So as long as you are able to sort of live a happy life while sort of, doing it in moderation and not harming others, that's sort of the key tenets of Zoroastrianism. Eventually, as long as sort of people do the right thing for long enough within this religious view, eventually there's going to be this ultimate victory of Ahura Mazda over Angreminu, and conquering of good over evil. And this is going to result in kind of a profound judgment day. Very similar to what eventually you're going to be seeing in the Christian religion, right? This idea of an eventual final battle and victory for the quote-unquote good guys. And at that point in time, everyone's going to be judged, with the good people going to a heavenly paradise, and those people who were not good going to sort of a hellish realm of pain and suffering. So very much that sort of idea of divine reward versus divine punishment based upon your behavior, very prevalent within Zoroastrianism. Another similarity between Zoroastrianism and a lot of the other religions we're going to be talking about is that it began as an oral tradition, stories being told about Zarathustra, and that these stories were only written down after the prophet's death. Now, in the case of Zoroastrianism, it was written down much later than some of the other religions we're going to be talking about, hundreds of years, but the fact that the Persian Empire was sort of the adopter of Zoroastrianism, and the Magi, the sort of the Zoroastrian priests, were so prevalent in the region. You can certainly see what a long, prolific impact it had, even before there was a huge written component to this religion. Other ideas of how this religion sort of tied in with future religions in the region, people mention sort of the idea and the expectation of praying a certain amount of times a day, very similar to certain aspects or certain sects of Christianity, which also have the requirement, and certainly Islam having the requirement of being able to expected to pray a certain number of times a day. Also very, very close here to Zoroastrianism. We already talked about that idea of sort of that divine conflict present in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as well as the idea of sort of divine praise or reward versus divine punishment. All of it very much sort of ties back to Zoroastrianism. It's interesting that Zoroastrianism is sort of the first evidence that we see this in the region, and that these other religions seem to, probably because they are very close in proximity to the Persian Empire. We already talked about sort of the impact that Cyrus the Great had on the Jewish people and their religion and their faith, that it's entirely possible that Zoroastrianism was a huge contributing factor to how these other religions in the region developed. What differences do you see between the Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sassanid empires? Describe how each empire was unique. Despite these differences, why are they still all considered to be Persian empires? So this obviously is going to be spanning a large period of time here, going between these three different empires, as they are sort of broken up by different phases, and are going to be really spanning almost 1,000 years of history, going from one end to the other, which is one of the reasons why the Persian Empire, in whichever form it takes, is going to be so sort of influential in the region, because it's very, very long lasting. So, of course, the Achaemenid Persian Empire was sort of the OG, right? The original Persian Empire. That's the one that was founded by Cyrus, was sort of codified by Darius. And that's, of course, the creation of the satrapies, the official coinage, the royal road, the Persian immortals for their military. And that was all the original Persian Empire. And of course, the Persian Empire, as we're going to be learning more about next week, is eventually going to be conquered by Alexander the Great. And he is going to, after his death, the Persian Empire is going to be broken up into a number of different regions, the majority of which is going to be controlled by the Seleucid dynasty. And the Seleucid dynasty is going to rule in the region for a while. It's a Greek dynasty. Essentially, the rulers were descendants of sort of Alexander the Great's generals. And they're going to essentially sort of try to blend Persian culture with Greek culture, with Middle Eastern culture in general, or Mesopotamian culture, depending on which region you're in. You'll be learning much more about that in the Hellenistic time period next week when we're talking about the Greeks. But eventually, the Seleucid dynasty is going to go in decline, and one of the satrapies towards sort of the steppeland region known as Parthia, because it was populated primarily by the Parni, which was one of those sort of steppeland nomadic groups that traveled and were sort of inhabiting a more of an agricultural region. They eventually rebel against the Seleucid dynasty and are able to take over a large swath of what had previously been the Persian Empire. So Mesopotamia is in this, Syria up to Armenia, essentially, all around the lower portions of the Caspian Sea and down to the Arabian Sea. All of this is going to be under the control of the Parni. Eventually, the Parthian dynasty. And the Parthians are going to be emulating, to a certain degree, some of the practices of the Achaemenids. They have the satrapy system, which they are emulating, but the Parthians are going to be a little bit less centralized. And a lot of times they're going to be sort of giving those satrapies over to clan leaders within their own Parni population, and it's going to lead to a certain degree, a little bit less stable of an empire, as each area is sort of more doing their own thing. But still, it's going to be a very strong power base that the Parni and the Parthians are going to be able to use, and it's really going to make them one of the only peoples that Rome is not able to deal with. Rome is going to have a heck of a time fighting against both the Parthians and the Sassanids. And the Parthians, for their part, are going to be such a problem for the Romans because they are still going to be maintaining that sort of steppeland nomadic warfare that was so effective, as far as sort of riding at your enemies, turning around, and firing a shot over your shoulder before the enemy has a chance to shoot at you, and take advantage of wide open spaces that your sort of cavalry can continually bombard enemies until they are exhausted, until they break formation, and you can come in and sort of finish them up. They're actually so successful at this method of warfare that maneuver of riding at an enemy, quickly turning around and shooting an arrow over your shoulder is actually eventually known as the Parthian shot, based on how effectively the Parthians are going to use it against the Roman Empire and their legions. One of the Roman civil wars is actually caused because one of the generals, who's supposed to be in sort of a power sharing alliance, Crassus, decides he wants to go and get a victory for himself to make himself look cool, and just ends up getting him and his legions completely killed and destroyed by, by the Parthians. So the Parthians are going to be playing a huge role in the sort of history of the surrounding people, and really are the sort of only people outside the bounds of the Roman Empire that the Romans never really considered barbarians, sort of considering them on an equal footing, primarily because the Romans got their butts kicked by them a couple different times. The Parthians, though, are for their own right going to be sort of going off that tradition of combining Greek culture with Persian culture, based on what the Seleucids had done and what the Achaemenid Persian Empire has done. But partially, it's going to be that decentralization, which is going to sort of be their undoing, as the sort of governor of the realm of Persia, which was one of the most strongest and powerful satrapies, and sort of had the strongest links back to the Achaemenid Persian Empire, is going to sort of declare independence and eventually take over the Parthian Empire. And that is eventually going to lead to the rise of the Sassanid Empire. The Sassanid Empire was named for a Zoroastrian priest named Sassan, and essentially there was a very much recommitment to Zoroastrianism by the Sassanids. They wanted to make that sort of the prevailing religion of the region. They were less tolerant towards other religions living within their borders than previous versions of the Persian Empire had been, and certainly wanted to make Zoroastrianism sort of the primary religion in the area. But the Sassanids are ultimately going to find a lot of success as well. They're also going to be sort of rivals to the Roman Empire, and eventually, when Rome splits into two different parts, the Eastern Empire becoming the Byzantine Empire, they're going to be rivals and warring with the Byzantine Empire as well. But the Sassanids are going to make a lot of advancements in their own right. They're going to bring much more land under cultivation. They're going to have a larger population size than any of the previous Persian empires. They're going to create sort of a banking system that is going to improve upon what the Achaemenids had already done, introducing ideas of kind of credit and checking. They're going to sort of reestablish a lot of those trade routes. And that's one thing that all of these different iterations of the Persian Empire have in common, is they're very much going to be benefiting of being essentially the western end of the Silk Road. So having commerce coming in from China, from India, from Central Asia is going to really be an important economic element to all three of these regions. But the Sassanids are going to certainly sort of be on the cutting edge of taking advantage of that. Sassanids are going to have some of the same military tactics as the Parthians did, but they're going to introduce more of a heavily armed cavalry, sort of a precursor of the knight, kind of what we think of sort of the medieval European warriors as being sort of very heavily armored cavalry units. They're going to be introducing that in their warfare. They also are going to be having a much more strict sort of caste system that they're going to be sort of imposing and regulating to try to sort of divide up who people are and what sort of social stratification system that they're supposed to fit into. But they're also going to be great preservers of knowledge. They're going to be very much literate, and leaders who are going to be the emperors of the Persian Empire are going to very much sort of take an interest in trying to expand knowledge. And they're also going to be taking a lot of knowledge that was obtained from the Greeks, not only the Greeks living in their area, but a lot of people in the Byzantine Empire. Once the Byzantine Empire turns to a less tolerant version of Christianity that starts to try to, first of all, push out any other sect of Christianity that sort of doesn't belong, that kind of or doesn't fit in with what they are trying to create, are going to be pushed into oftentimes the Parthian lands, as well as some of the Greek science and writing and technology that is sort of seen as heretical by the Byzantine church is going to be finding a home in the Parthian Empire. Eventually, a lot of that knowledge is going to be transferred on to the Islamic empires, which are going to make even more advancements on it. Based on some of the science and research that was begun by the Greeks, picked up by this new iteration of the Persian Empire, and sort of carrying it on down the road. And some of that knowledge will then be reintroduced back into Europe right around the time of the Renaissance. And is one of the reasons why the Renaissance actually gets sparked is a reintroduction, primarily at that point in time, from the Islamic empires and kingdoms in the region back into Europe. So certainly the Sassanids are going to have a strong emphasis in sort of preserving knowledge and science for themselves and also for future peoples as well. So these are some of the main differences that you see between the Achaemenids, the Parthians, and the Sassanids. But some of the reasons why they're all still considered Persian empires is that they oftentimes rely on that sort of original Achaemenid Persian empire as far as their sort of governing structure goes. Also, the interconnectivity of it, the reliance upon trade and the Silk Road, the fact that they're all going to be to varying degrees focused around Zoroastrianism as their main primary religion. And like I said, these are all going to be having varying levels of success, but in the region, very very impactful all the way up until the 800 or so, slightly before that. CE, when of course the sort of great expansion of Islamic armies coming out of the Arabian Peninsula is going to be overthrowing the Sassanid Empire. But even after that time period, the creation of some of the very early Islamic caliphates, particularly the Abbasid Caliphate, is going to be very heavily influenced by the Persian Empire. And you're really going to see a lot of Persian culture passed on into those later Islamic empires, and all the way through the Ottoman Empire, almost into the 20th century, you're going to see the vestiges of the Persians very very influential in the region, and even the modern country of Iran can trace its heritage back to to these empires and these dynasties, which is still a strong point of national pride. And of course, there's going to be a lot of other sort of regional influences that the Persian Empire is going to have, whether it's influences on the Romans, influences on the Byzantines, eventually the Tsars in Russia, the British Empire. Sort of the entire idea of European kingship is to a certain degree based upon the concept of the sort of king of kings imperial model that the Persians set up here. So very long-lasting, far-reaching impacts of this empire.
Many aspects of the Persian Empire would be borrowed or emulated by future empires, for example, Rome, Byzantium, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Ottomans, and eventually even European empires such as Russia and Britain. What aspects developed by the Persians do you think were or could have been borrowed by these future empires? And once more, a lot of people did a really good job pointing to the sort of political aspects of the empire, the way the empire was divided up into sort of different satrapies or states, how taxation was pretty much imposed on ability to pay, how there was kind of this combined imperial ruling ideology of what kind of one group ruling over a massive amount of peoples and cultures, but still finding a way to make them all or allow them to all sort of work together. And not to feel completely sort of overruled. A lot of the sort of trappings and ideology of what an emperor should be eventually gets borrowed by the Romans, by the Byzantines, by the Islamic empires, for example, the Abbasid caliphates, the caliphs, the sultans of the Ottomans. They're all following a very similar kind of imperial ideology that's really started with the Persians, and like I said, you could even trace that up to the czars of Russia. A lot of that same mentality is borrowed and included. At the same point in time, the Persians are going to have really a direct impact on the various Western states that are developed. For example, they are kind of the main rival of the Roman Empire. Eventually, they become the main rival of the Byzantine Empire as well, through various sort of iterations of the Persian empires. Of course, they're also a rival of the traditional Greek city-states. We're going to be talking about Greece. So you can see that Persia is sort of always an example, but also a rival to a lot of the state structures that are developing. A lot of people do a very good job talking about their infrastructure as well. For example, the idea of the Royal Road, how important that was to get news and information from one side of the empire to another. And that certainly was part of it. The structure of their military, the sort of imperial force that's directly loyal to a king rather than a particular governor or regional ruler. That's something the Romans probably should have done a better job of, as increasingly you see these sort of local generals, for example, getting their own legions, their own armies that are much more loyal to them than they are to the larger state. The Persian Empire did a very good job sort of avoiding that and making all of the imperial armies kind of a centralized army, not regional armies, which seem to do produce very good results for the most part on their part. So yeah, I thought you did a very good job of combining a lot of these together and showing how, in a lot of ways, the Persian Empire was sort of the standard bearers for most future empires, at least in sort of the Western world that we're going to be talking about. The Eastern world, of course, really China is kind of the center of their imperial models that are developed. And it's sort of interesting how you have sort of the Persian Empire in the West and the Chinese empires in the East sort of being these models that you see a lot of the surrounding ruling ideologies oftentimes sort of branching off of or emulating to a certain degree.
And this is kind of an interesting inscription here, the Bestun inscription by King Darius, and that I think it's pretty interesting to really kind of look at the presence of inherent bias within a document such as this. So first of all, what does Darius do or attempt to use, or how is he attempt to use this inscription to show that he's a legitimate and rightful ruler? First of all, he starts off right away by trying to argue that he's from this long line of kings. Long ago, our family had been kings. 8 of my family were formerly kings. I am the 9th. And then kind of detailing the war he had with Gautama, the Magian, the Magi, and how he sort of wrested the kingdom from him. I took from him by the grace of Ahura Mazda, or by the grace of God, essentially. I became king. Ahura Mazda gave me the kingdom. Kind of once more showing that through kind of divine intervention, he has become the king. And scrolling on down, this kind of last period here where he's going through all these people he waged and conquered, sort of showing that once he was king, he was able to hang on to the kingship, waged all these battles, all these wars against all these pretenders to the throne, and sort of making himself the correct king in that way. Of course, as you all realize with the second question, all this might not have been as simple and easy as Darius wanted to make it sound. And I think a lot of you were able to find evidence that maybe not everything Darius is saying and talking about here is 100% accurate or 100% correct. First of all, a lot of you pointed out that even his story about taking the kingdom back from Gautama, the Magi, seems rather problematic as far as the dates, when things happened, when things are mentioned. Just the fact that if he's from this long line of kings already, why was there this other king who was already there? And of course, looking back and studying the history, you realize that the Persian Empire was created by Cyrus the Great, and that Darius had absolutely no relation to Cyrus the Great, which means that as much as Darius wants to pretend and make himself a king here, that ultimately he is more or less a pretender to the throne, although he tries to do a lot in the inscription of making it seem like he is the kind of natural king and this natural progression from this royal line, which never really existed prior to this. He says at one point in time that the kingdom, which was taken away from my family, was put in its place. Once more, we know that that might not be 100% accurate, just looking at the other evidence that we have. Another interesting place, and I don't know a lot of people picked up on this, where you can kind of see that perhaps not everything is quite as neat and simple as Darius wants to make it sound, is this list of wars he's engaging with in Armenia. For example, says Darius the king, Dardarish by name, an Armenian, my subject, I sent him forth to Armenia. Thus I said, go, the rebellious army, which does not call itself mine, smite it. And of course, afterwards he says, by the grace of Ahura Mazda, my army smote that rebellious army utterly. Oh, great. So he was able to send out his army to subdue the Armenians. That sounds pretty straightforward, right? Well, then you go down to the next section here, and he says, a second time the rebels came together. Well, it raises the immediate question that if you had smote the rebellious army so utterly, up here in the previous paragraph, who was left to rebel against you again? But okay, there was a second rebellion, so he sends his army out again, and my army smote that rebellious army utterly. Okay, so 2 times now there's problems in Armenia. He sends out his army, which supposedly utterly smites the enemy. However, just one more line down, a 3rd time the rebels came together. Once more, Darius sends out his army, and Ahura Mazda, with all of his strength and power, his army smote the rebellious army utterly. So you get the sense that if really these victories had been as clear-cut and as confident as he's trying to make it sound, why would there be a second, a third, and then go down one more line, a 4th rebellion? So that you can certainly see that this probably was not as easy and straightforward a military conflict as he's trying to make it sound, as certainly these rebellious groups are continuing to pop up and fight against him, and that he's having to continuously send armies back to the region, which means, entirely possible that his armies may not have been as successful in the earlier campaigns as he might have wanted to make it sound, that it took 3 or 4 attempts or tries to eventually secure the area. Moving on down once more to this section where he's listing all these kings that were pretenders to the throne and going through and just mentioning each one and saying how he lied. I've highlighted them all here. He lied, he lied, he lied, he lied, he lied. Rather seems rather suspicious when you're looking at the inscription. There he's naming these people, calling them all liars, and pretty much saying he's only not a liar himself because he's the one who ultimately ends up conquering them. And that brings us to the last line in the document here, where I think it's pretty telling, where he says, "Let it convince thee as to what was done by me, regard it not as lies." Now, anytime you see a document that ends with someone pretty much saying, "Hey, by the way, I haven't been lying to you this whole time," you might want to be a little suspicious. That's ultimately what we see here with the Bestun inscription and with Darius. The fact that there's rather convincing evidence that not everything which he is saying here should be taken at face value. So that really brings us down to number 3. What is the best way for historians or people that are looking critically at the past to use biased sources such as this, and should they be used at all? Some people said yes, some people said no, and I'm going to let you in on the secret here. Every single source that we're going to look at this semester and any other semester when you're studying history is going to be in some way, shape, or form biased. That's not saying it's a bad source, but it's simply acknowledging that every source that we're looking at is going to have its author, and that author was going to be writing from a particular context, right? They're going to be writing from a particular time period, they're going to be from a particular culture, and that all of those elements are going to be factored into the writing. Some might be more politically motivated, such as the Bestun inscription we're looking at here, than others, but all of the sources that we're looking at are going to be biased. So essentially, yes, historians have to use biased sources because we pretty much can't not use them, otherwise we wouldn't be able to say anything about history. The real important part, though, is how you're going to use them. For example, with the Bestun inscription here, this actually provides a lot of really good information, the conflicts that may have been occurring, the individuals who are involved, but we certainly want to be careful of Darius's claims on face value, and certainly want to start checking into other people's accounts, right? Trying to find archaeological evidence that might support some of this, trying to find other historical evidence, writings from other authors from this time period that might shine light on this time period and what ultimately ends up happening, and not just taking the inscription by itself. And that's really the key here with any historical document, is trying to use it to get the information you can. A lot of times that includes just teasing out kind of ancillary information that the authors might not have intended to put in there at all, but that we can still use to get an idea of their society, where they're coming from, and so forth, and still being able to use that to say something about the past. But certainly, the claims for as far as his legitimate kingship, things like that, you'll certainly want to be checking that with other sources and thinking more critically about it before you go ahead and make some definitive answers. So, yeah, the fact that bias is going to be present in all the documents we're looking at, but it's really just something we need to take account and be aware of as we look at them, and try to factor that into how we're thinking about the documents, how we're interpreting them, and how wide we want to use that document to speak for an entire population, an entire event, an entire group of people, an entire historical situation. Obviously, the more perspectives you can find on any historical element, the better served you're going to be with the more context you can develop around it. And that's really the point of looking at this document from this week, is a very good example of this. Thank you all very much, and I hope you have good luck moving into week 6.